In this lecture, we're going to think about how economies are structured, the rules that guide economic decisions. Economics is very interested in how we coordinate our lives together, right? Supply and demand, workers and managers, consumers and firms. So economists spend a lot of their time thinking about questions such as, how much income does the average person earn in a year? Is this higher or lower than last year? Which industries are growing? Which are shrinking? How much do houses cost in a particular city? We can think of this as the economic game, as it were. The rules have been set and what's happening in the game, right? And the game's really important. It's what defines our day-to-day reality, right? If I have a job, that's great. If I don't, that's bad. And so while the game is important, sometimes we need to back up and consider more fundamental questions like, are the rules of the game appropriate? Do the rules need to change? Do they need to be modified? Do we need to play an entirely different game? When I was growing up, I was really into baseball. I loved baseball, and I still do. And I was pretty good for a while. But as you grow up, the rules start to change. You start with the tee, you hit the ball off the tee, then you go to a pitching machine, coach's pitch, and so on. It's the same game, but the rules are a little bit different, right? Who pitches the ball changes. Well, my love of baseball changed when kids were allowed to start pitching and I saw my first curveball. At one moment, the ball was coming towards me. At another moment, it wasn't. At that moment, I knew I was done with baseball. The rules had changed such that I wasn't going to be good at it. I wasn't going to find it fun. I was going to find it terrifying. So I went and found a new game to play. So in this lecture, we're going to think about the rules of the game and whether they need to change, and specifically the pros and cons, the merits, the relative strength and weakness of capitalism and socialism. This is our question for the moment. We're not going to think about feudalism or mercantilism, hunters or gatherers, capitalism or socialism. And what we want to do is determine which provides a better set of rules. And so I'm going to spoil the lecture immediately and do something I'll call a Tarantino. So Quentin Tarantino is a famous director. A lot of his early movies, he would do this thing where he starts at the end and then works backwards, right? So I'm going to start at the end and then work backwards. And so what I mean is this. I am going to argue for capitalism, and then I'll justify my stance. This image we see is the Korean peninsula at night, all right? And on the north is obviously North Korea, and the south is South Korea. And what's especially relevant for our discussion is that up until the mid-20th century, this was an area that had a very similar culture, people. Even now, the climate isn't really different between North and South Korea, but things have changed radically, right? The Korean peninsula is divided into two countries, North and South Korea. Both of these countries consider themselves democratic republics, right? North Korea considers itself a democratic republic. Outsiders would label it a socialistic dictatorship. South Korea also considers itself a democratic republic, while outsiders would label it a presidential system, very similar to the political system we have in the United States. And so when we look at this image, what is striking is how clear the artificial boundary between these two nations are. The 38th parallel is not an imposing mountain range. It's not a raging river. It's just a line in the sand, right? It's a line in the sand, but we can clearly see where North Korea is and where South Korea begins. When we look to the north, we don't see much to distinguish North Korea, right? There's a void. There's not much to distinguish it from the seas that surround it. As we look to the south, we see lights and lights and more lights. And when we take a step back, what creates this light is what Alfred Marshall, the famous economist, called the everyday business of life, right? It's families making dinner, maybe watching TV, friends going out for a night on a town. Maybe it's an ambulance driving to the hospital to deliver a baby at 3 a.m. All of these things create light. And the absence of light suggests little of this is happening in North Korea. And so when I think about the type of economy I want to live in, I'm going to choose South Korea over North Korea every time. And I'm not alone. Take a moment to think about the last time you heard about a refugee crisis at the gates of North Korea or Cuba or China, right? When was the last time there were too many people trying to get into those countries? It just doesn't happen. If anything, it happens in the opposite. People flee these nations to find countries that are liberal democracies, countries that economies are based on capitalism rather than socialism. I will say this though, before we move on. When I think about where I want to travel, places I want to go, I would choose North Korea. I'd love to see something novel and unique. I like to camp with my family. One of my favorite things about camping is to see the night sky in places that aren't near cities. So if I want an adventure, North Korea is what I'd choose. But if I want a place to live, it's going to be South Korea. Okay, I've given you my punchline, but it's pretty flimsy, to be honest. It's conjecture. I've never been to the Korean Peninsula, so it's based on things that I have little experience with. It's based on knowledge of a corner of the world that I've never been to. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's Tarantino it and rewind and outline some principles to guide our decision between capitalism and socialism and see where we end up. All right, and to do this, I want us to get rid of all the things that we think we know, right? Jettison your biases, your preconceived notions. Forget about what I just said about the Korean Peninsula. Let's start with a blank slate and see where we get. To do this, we're going to apply a mental exercise made famous by John Rawls. John Rawls was an American philosopher of the 20th century and very, very influential. And he came up with this idea, the veil of ignorance. Right, so the veil of ignorance asks us to do some things as we think about social questions or how we might structure an economy. So as we step behind the veil of ignorance, as we seek to understand principles that should guide the ways that we structure the economy, there's a few rules to guide the exercise. One, we have to forget who we are, our position, the things that we've been given or not given in this life. Right? So for me, I need to try to be ignorant to the fact that I'm a white male that grew up in Northern Virginia, the son of Phil and Becky Peach. I need to forget that I'm an economics professor, right? I need to forget these things because what we want to do is come up with principles that we would all agree on regardless of the outcomes. All right? Often, in this exercise, you're asked to ignore notions of the good life or the ways that life ought to be. And I'm not going to ask you to do that for two reasons. One, this is a course on justice. And to understand justice, you need to bring a moral compass with you, right? And so if we're going to argue that justice is part of the good life, we need to understand what justice is, and we need to bring notions of morality with us. So that's one reason that we can't ignore the good life, the goals, if you will. The second is when we're thinking like economists, when we're acting like economists, we can't just sit in an armchair and be philosophers in a distant land. We need to be pragmatic. We need to go into the world and see what's actually happening, right? And so to do that, we need to take notions of the good life. We need to understand things that are better or worse, preferred or not preferred. So we'll step behind the veil of ignorance. We'll ignore our position in life as it is in 2021, and we'll seek to understand whether capitalism or socialism is a better way to structure our economy. So let's define those terms. These are terms that are rife for misunderstanding, to be misconstrued. So let's set the table with a common definition. Let's define capitalism as an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than the state. Let me say that again. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Socialism. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Let me say that again. A political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Okay, let's pick out a few defining characteristics of these definitions that are important. One, we immediately see that the economic and political are linked, right? The rules of the game in the economy are linked to the rules of the game in the political sphere, right? We immediately see overlap in both of these systems. The second thing to note is they differ explicitly on who owns the means of production. In capitalism, it's private individuals. So the means of production are simply the things that you need to produce something, right? So in filming this video, you need to have a camera, you need to have a computer, and so on. A private actor, in this case, George Fox University, owns those things. It's not a community, it's not the government, okay? The second distinction is who regulates production, distribution, and exchange. In socialism's definition, we're told that it's by the community. In capitalism's definition, we're simply told it's not the state. So what's inferred in that is it's private actors most of the time. So when we think about regulation in this context, it's not necessarily making up explicit laws, it's more the ways that we operate, right? So when I choose to not drink tea, I am quote unquote regulating my decisions into that market, right? Or maybe you do drink tea, right? So it's private actors that are dictating the ways that the economy operates in capitalism, and then it's communal actors in socialism. So we need to say a word about community, right? Socialism can take on different forms. You could have a community that looks something like a commune, meaning a bunch of people get together, they're gonna share the land, they're gonna work the land, they're gonna share what they farm, and that might be a socialistic commune. We're not gonna talk about that, we're gonna compare countries. Okay, so we're gonna compare countries that operate under socialism with countries that operate under capitalism. So when we do that, the community becomes the state or government. Right, so practically, again, stepping out of the philosopher's armchair, practically when we say community, what we mean is government, okay? And this will be important later in the lecture. So now that we have these definitions in place, I want us to create a scoreboard. I want us to think about how we might evaluate what's actually happening in economies that are capitalist or socialist and evaluate who's playing the game better, all right? And so I'm going to offer 3 measures, and I'd like you to come up with your own, but let me offer mine first. My first measure is this. I want to measure how much money people are actually making. Okay, so measure 1, scoreboard tally number 1 is how much money people are actually making. The second thing I care about is equity, right? How are the material gains, how is income distributed? Do a few people have a lot? Do people widely share in abundance? So I care about equity. And then the third thing I care about is freedom, right? So we talked about economic and political being intertwined. I care about people having economic freedom to choose the career that they want to, and also political freedom to choose the leaders that they want. So my 3 elements for my scoreboard are income, equity, and freedom. I'd like you to think about what you might add to your scoreboard, and in a minute or 2, we'll do that explicitly. Okay, So before we start looking at the scoreboard, we need to think about what do we do with economic and political power? Because these definitions tie these things together. Should they be combined, right? Should the economic and political be explicitly tied to one another? Should they be set off in separate spheres? And there's reasons to combine them, and there's also reasons to separate them. When we combine power, that helps us get things done. I think of my family as an example. My wife and I have the power. If our children had power, very little would get done. They would exercise their power to not do the dishes, not clean their rooms, probably not go to school, right? So when we think about the economy, when there's concentrated or combined power between the political and economic spheres, things can get done, right? We make a decision and we move forward. We don't have to haggle. We don't have to get people on board. The decision's been made and we do it, right? But there's also downsides. It's hard to know what people want, right? When I make a decision for an entire country, how do I know what people want? How do I know what's good for them? When we think about the economy, how much should we make? What should the prices be? Should we even use prices? So there's merit, there's strength, there's benefits in consolidating economic and political power, but there's also going to be limits and weaknesses. If we look at the other side of the spectrum and we allow economic and political power to be distributed, allow them to be separated, what we're going to gain is autonomy, right? People will have more say in the lives that they lead. People can live the lives that they want. You can try to be an entrepreneur. You can be a doctor. You can pursue those things that you want to do. There's a lot of autonomy. And in general, we think of this as a good thing. But there's also downsides to this, right? We've referred many times to ways in which we might not know what's best for ourselves, right? So if I decide that I want to be a point guard, I'm going to spend the rest of my life practicing to become a point guard. This is a delusional dream for me. I am never going to be a point guard in the NBA. So there's all kinds of reasons that maybe we want to limit There's all kinds of reasons we may want to limit people's autonomy. Or maybe we want to coordinate political and economic decisions during a public health crisis, perhaps, or some other national emergency. So now we're ready to tally our score. We have our definitions. I've offered 3 elements of a scoreboard. I want you to think of one more to add. Maybe it's health, maybe it's education, maybe it's environmental damages or environmental quality. So I want you to add one more element to the scoreboard. Again, mine was income, equity, and freedom. I'd like you to add one more. Again, maybe it's health, maybe it's gender equality, whatever you want that thing to be. Add a 4th column. And this is what we're going to do. You'll be provided with data sources for my 3 measures: a data source for income, a data source for equity, and a data source for freedom. And then in class, you'll find other data sources for the different measures that we've decided to include. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to compare, we're going to look at the actual score, the ways that countries are playing the game. And so I have a list of countries that identify as socialist nations, and we're going to compare them to the US. We're going to use the US as the representative capitalist economy. There's many others that we could choose, but for most of us, that's the economy we know the best. All right, so the nations that we are going to compare the United States to are China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, and Tanzania. And there'll be a list provided, but it's, again, China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, and Tanzania. And so in this, you're going to tally a score. And I want you to tally the score for per capita GDP, income inequality, and then economic freedom. And again, links will be provided for those. Okay, we have our list, we have our score, and what you'll do on your own is tally the score. I'm not going to give you the answer, right? I want you to find which countries are providing the highest incomes for the average person, which countries are more equitable in terms of income inequality, which countries offer more economic freedom. And as you tally that score, you'll see which countries are playing the game better, as I've defined it, and which are worse. And then you'll also include your tally. And so we've compared, or we will compare, these socialist countries to the United States. And that's just the beginning. We probably need to offer more capitalist economies as a point of comparison, but this is a way to dip our toes in the water to see how the game is being played. And as you look at the score, I want to ask you, what set of rules would you choose for an economy that you would live in? Which set of rules allows more people to realize their economic goals? Which set of rules allows more people to lead a virtuous life? Which set of rules leads to a just society? Right? We can incorporate the economic measures that we've mentioned, but also the virtues and principles we've discussed in our previous lectures. And so as you think about which set of rules you'd consider, I'll leave you with two final thoughts. The first is this. During the 20th century, there were too many atrocities, too many crimes The first is this. During the 20th century, there were too many atrocities, too many crimes against humanity, too much horror. I'm thinking of the Holocaust, China's Great Leap Forward, and the terror of life in the USSR under Stalin. When we think about these atrocities, the list that I've given you, we need to ask the question, why do so many authoritarian governments show up on this list? Why do socialist nations, with their stated goal of being communal and acting in the best interest of the community, why are they so adept at destroying community? Why are they so adept at destroying the thing that they're tasked to manage and steward? Why, as Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, observed, why has no famine ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy? What about socialism has led to these dire atrocities? And then the second thing is this, and I'll leave you with this. In the US, why is socialism becoming more appealing and capitalism less appealing? Why are more Americans becoming discontent with capitalism? What are its problems? What things need to be fixed? What's the appeal of socialism? What are the ways in which the US economy is floundering? What are the ways in which it's not helping everyone live the life that they want to live? Ways in which it's not allowing us to live virtuously or hindering us from living out lives of economic justice?